Today we're going to start a series of these devotions. They're readings of the poetry of John Donne. So I thought I would give, at least today, a brief overview of who John Donne was. I'm going to read when the time comes from this edition of his poetry. And on the front cover, you can see a picture, and of course, online, you saw the cover slide that had a picture of him. He was born 8 years after Shakespeare, and he grew up in essentially the same atmosphere, except that he was part of a Roman Catholic family. In England at the time, the Catholics were suspect, and they had to pay fines, but they weren't made totally illegal. That would change during Donne's lifetime. But when he was born, his family could remain Catholic. And for him, one of the big things was that it meant that after he graduated from college, or was about to graduate, he was not allowed to receive a degree because he was not part of the Church of England. Could go through, get the education, but just not be awarded the degree when it was all over. Later on in his life, he would move to the Church of England. And at that point, eventually, he was given even an honorary doctorate from Cambridge at the end of his life, or toward the end of his life. The first part of his career, he was trying to become a diplomat and trying to sort of work his way up the ladder, if you will. That was part of English officialdom. And he was beginning to do that. But he was very much clearly a careerist kind of a person. He got a couple good appointments and was on his way. He had a reputation as being a little bit of a womanizer, we'd say a player, and much of his early poetry I would say was about wine, women, and song, but there's not much wine in there. The songs he was writing, but they were about the women. And that got him quite a reputation, which meant that when he did find a woman that he loved deeply and was ready to settle down with her, her father would not have liked the idea, and clearly did not like the idea. Her father, when he finally found this woman, whose name was Anne Moore, her father was the lieutenant of the Tower of London, which basically meant he was in charge of the Tower of London. And so John Donne and Anne Moore got married, but did so secretly. But you couldn't keep it secret forever. And when it did come to light, he found himself as a guest of the crown in a prison himself. Eventually, the people involved got over it. She had married without her father's permission. He had married without the permission of his boss, Thomas Egerton. And they escaped with their lives, but his career was in tatters. And he began to put it all together again. It also sent him into a little bit of a tailspin in his spiritual life. That and a few other things. He moved from being Catholic to being Protestant, and did eventually become part of the Church of England. And as he put things together again, and as Queen Elizabeth died and King James took over, the king began to show Donne some favor once more. And he was ordered by the king to be ordained. I have not heavily researched all of this stuff. I've looked it over, but I'm sure someone has come up with the reasons that happened. I didn't look them up. You can do it. And he began to sort of rise through the clergy ranks the way he had before. But this time he was doing it with actual conviction. During his law career, it was a way of making money. In this way, he actually was exercising his talents as a poet and as a speaker. And he became one of the most effective as well as popular preachers that the Church of England was producing at the time. He became a chaplain to the king. There was a whole bunch of people who were appointed to the royal chapel, but he was one of them. And eventually his top appointment, if you will, in that way, was as Dean of Westminster. He and Anne had 12 children, and she died in childbirth, or shortly thereafter. She gave birth, and 5 days later she died. It was something that touched him deeply, and a lot of his later poetry dealt with issues around death and dying and faith that overcomes death. The poems that we'll mostly read are what were called his holy sonnets. He himself never published them, nor most of his poetry, during his lifetime. Things were passed around. People knew he was a poet. They knew he was a very good one. But it wasn't that somebody put together a book called John Donne's Poetry. The holy sonnets, which are the ones we're going to look at, mostly appeared in a separate publication 2 years after his death. He died in 1631. They appeared in 1633. Another edition came out 2 years after that had a few more poems. There are some that appeared in what was called the Westmoreland manuscript of these things that appeared independently. And eventually they got around. He was somebody who personified and exemplified a certain school of poetry that's sometimes called the metaphysical poets. People who would take one image or one theme and just run with it in a lot of different directions, almost exhausting the theme or the way of looking at something within one poem. This kept his reputation going, and he really took off, however, in the early 1900s, almost 300 years after his death, because T.S. Eliot really championed the writings of Donne around that time and gave him a new lease on life, if you will. If I were following in Donne's pattern, I would say that it was a resurrection of his works. Resurrection being a big theme in the poems that we'll be hearing. Now, I've babbled on here, so I'm not going to keep up much longer. The rest of these readings, day by day, are going to be a lot shorter. But I'll start them out with this, which is not a sonnet. It's his hymn to God the Father. Wilt thou forgive that sin where I begun, which is my sin, though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive those sins through which I run, and do them still, though still I do deplore? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. Wilt thou forgive that sin by which I have won others to sin, and made my sin their door? Wilt thou forgive that sin which I did shun a year or two, but wallowed in a score? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. I have a sin of fear that when I have spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore. Swear by thyself that at my death thy sun shall shine as it shines now and heretofore, and having done that thou hast done, I have no more. See you tomorrow.